Hello, this is Borderline Latina, and I am taking over. I am taking over the Media Critique Sheet podcast with my wonderful musings, opinions, and conversations related to a variety of different topics under mental health, wellness, etc., etc. And as always, these conversations are non-scripted, but informed by my experience, which is valid, just as valid as me also referencing research, theories, and etc. Let's jump into it. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about small talk, or more precisely, obliterating it, incinerating it, destroying it, smashing it, getting rid of it, deconstructing it. Well, I guess I have to get deconstructed before I get rid of it. But the reason I wanted to talk about this, and this is probably, as one can see in my other episodes, an ongoing theme. Small talk has always confused me. It's intrigued me, but not in a good way, a way of questioning its purpose and existence. And I find it very interesting because usually when folks talk about not enjoying small talk, it's usually attributed to a personality trait, specifically the personality trait of introversion versus extroversion, or shyness versus someone not being shy. But I often wonder, why does it have to be that particular association? As if to say, the reason you don't like small talk is because you have to be this, you have to be introverted. Not to say that if you're introverted, you must like small talk. I'm just saying that there could be other reasons not to like small talk, or you can just not like small talk because you don't like it. You don't think it's a good thing. I think I fall into that category. Also, the reason I bring the whole introversion versus extroversion, or shyness versus not shyness, and shyness is different from introversion, where typically introversion is defined as people who like to spend time on their own, people that have limited energy reserves in terms of interacting with other folks, so they like to conserve their energy by being by themselves. Versus shyness as being, it can be kind of related, but shyness can be more associated with like a particular fear of speaking in public. So an introverted person may not necessarily be afraid of speaking in public or afraid to be around others. They just don't like to be or choose not to be. I, however, like to challenge how people get labeled that. Now, for one, I think it's completely fine and great and natural for someone to label themselves as being introverted, for example, or shy. That's fine if someone, finds information about it, learns about it, and go, hey, this describes me to a T. Perfect, great. What I have a little issue and struggle with is it being attributed to folks by other people, and I think that happens often. And it happens usually when folks are looking at someone, how they behave in a particular setting, and they go, for example, oh, I haven't really heard this person speak that much in a particular setting, and so they automatically assume that the person's either introverted or shy. And that really always kind of astounds me, because it's very interesting for someone to make that leap, I guess I would say, a leap of judgment based on how someone acts in one particular setting. When I think of, and you can attribute introversion, extroversion to different settings, but usually if it's more of a stable personality trait, it would be across multiple different types of social settings. And typically the people that attribute, not typically, but oftentimes, those people that attribute it in the ways that I think are problematic is when they only see them in like very limited situations. So if you don't see someone speak up in a staff meeting, for example, you automatically assume the person's introverted or shy, versus like maybe they just don't like speaking up in staff meetings. But that doesn't mean that they are necessarily introverted in other places, or don't like to hang around people, or don't speak up in other people, and around other people in different social situations. there's very limited, information to that. But I think and it makes sense in a lot of different ways, not to say that I'm not guilty of that. I think we all are guilty to some extent of making conclusions or drawing conclusions and connections to stuff with limited information. That is technically a bias. That's one of the biases, right? And I'm blanking on the particular bias it is. Y'all can mention in the comments what particular one I'm talking about. But yeah, just kind of drawing those conclusions and making those connections based on limited information, right? Overgeneralizing it. Why am I talking about introversion, extroversion? Yes, because of small talk. So before also jumping into small talk, one of the things I also do want to mention, because I think it's important for this conversation, is the labeling of introversion and extroversion in certain public spheres. I wonder if we can even attribute it to certain people in certain situations, because what if it isn't a matter of the person being introverted or extroverted? What if the particular sphere or public space that the person isn't conducive or is oppressive to them being their authentic selves? So in other words, they can't truly be their authentic selves, which may be more, let's say, for example, more extroverted than people tend to think it is, because they've been historically oppressed, right? Or, they've been marginalized, or they've had, negative consequences in the past of being themselves. It's not safe to be their complete self, so they may behave in ways that other people may mistakenly think of it being introverted. But it's a matter of them being like, I have to kind of be myself or keep to myself, because being more extroverted is going to have more consequences. So I was like, who's defining who and what and why? Going back to small talk, because this is all connected. I often wonder the purpose of small talk. So taking away from introversion and extroversion, or shyness or not shyness, why can't we just say we don't like small talk for the purpose of small talk? Why does it have to be attributed to some sort of personality trait that's oftentimes used in a pejorative sense? Like, oh, well, they're just introverted, so they don't like small talk. It's because they're introverted, right? Like, it's a bad thing. And then also, why does it have to be that particular thing? So small talk, to me, I don't think it serves a purpose. And before I continue talking about small talk, I just want to say that recently, or relatively recently at the time of this recording, I had released a poem that talked about how I don't like to be called a nice person. I don't call myself a nice person. Particularly, I don't like to call myself a nice person. I'd rather have either people attribute it to me, or I just don't like to use that term at all, because I think that term implies accommodating to other people's needs, to make them feel uncomfortable. Like, when we really talk about someone being nice, are we really talking about someone being kind, or are we talking about them, going out of their way to make people feel uncomfortable, being that kind of over-accommodating thing, which is also gendered in a lot of ways. Typically, you see women having the societal pressures to be nice, right? And why do I have to put so much effort to make everyone else comfortable? That might go beyond their natural exclusivity to do it. So if they want to do it, that's fine. But it's difference between them naturally and wanting to do it versus feeling like they have to, even if it isn't something that they would naturally be inclined to do. So I think small talk falls under those categories of like this pressure to accommodate, to follow some sort of script to make other people comfortable. And in particular, small talk that I don't like are the canned questions that people feel like they need to ask people. Let's say it every morning, right? Or after a weekend or something like that. Like, they have to ask those questions, even if it doesn't really make any sense, just because it's kind of the social convention that we have to do with one another. And for me, I think conversation, at least for me personally, my conversations, I want them to have meaning and purpose. So, for example, if I know, like you told me before, that you had plans over the weekend to do this specific thing that I thought was interesting, then yeah, maybe on a Monday I may ask you, how did that thing go? Because that was of interest of me. But the canned, just asking people what their weekend was, How was their weekend? What they do over the weekend? How's your, like, those things just to ask for the sake of asking, even if I really don't think it makes particular sense. Those are the things I question. I don't have that natural inclination to ask certain questions like that unless there's some sort of need or purpose or reason for doing that for me. So I don't like asking those questions, and I don't like being asked those questions. I'll give you one of the best and clearest examples where I thought was really obvious that the small talk conversations are meaningless was during the pandemic, where all social conventions were basically thrown to the wayside. I mean, like, we're not talking about, and I'm talking about the pandemic, the time when we were quarantined, which obviously that's what most people think about in the pandemic, even though technically we are still in the pandemic, but we're being more social. Everyone was inside. No one could go outside. No one had any significant social outdoor plans, right? You're stuck inside. You couldn't really do that much. So why did people still feel the need to ask people, how was their weekend? And more specifically, what did they do? That's that shit that gets me kind of like, why? Why do you feel like it? You don't have to ask, right? Like, if the same question is going to be like, well, how's your weekend? Well, shitty because you couldn't go anywhere. What'd you do? I didn't really do that much because I was inside and I was limiting what I could do. Like, those are the types of things that I think we need to kind of question one another. Like, if we feel like we need to say to do things just purely out of social convention, or we think that that's what people are supposed to do, maybe it might be worth challenging and breaking out of it. And for folks who don't follow the quote-unquote social conventions, and I'm using social conventions like the Big Bang Theory, Sheldon uses it. People say that to get them to do things, but I think, like, why does it have to be this kind of like, oh, if it's social convention, we just do it to do it? We shouldn't give people shit for not wanting to do that. So those are kind of my tidbits for today. You know, what's the purpose of small talk? Do we really need to say the same canned questions? Maybe we should find another way to interact with one another. Or not. It's our choice. All right. Now. I can feel it. I can feel it that either at this particular point of the episode, or most likely before this, people are starting to feel uncomfortable or feel that I am being mean or cruel about this topic and how I'm talking about this topic. And if you're starting to feel those things, I invite you to question that, where that's coming from. Where is that desire for you, or that inclination of me not being nice or seeming brash or crass? Brash? You get what I'm trying to say with this. And I think it ties into these expectations of conversation. Once again, that gendered expectation of, well, girls are supposed to be nice and polite and cordial. And I think this is prominent in certain regions of the country compared to others, this idea of the art of conversation, like starting conversations, greeting people, inviting the small talk, trying to get people, settled and calm or engaged. And the reason I say it's regional is because I think that I've noticed this less during the times that I've spent in the north or northeast than I do in other regions of the country. I think people in the north and northeast, they're more straight to the point and blunt. And that often includes times where, we don't necessarily speak to one another. We don't feel like we need to kind of fill the room with conversations. Oftentimes you can see people they stick to their business, their mind is in the world, and they navigate the world. They pass by, people, and they don't necessarily say hi or hello or engage in those types of conversation. And in many instances, that's socially acceptable. Where in other situations, if there are a group of people gathered together, there's a public space and there's silence, I'm beginning to see that there's an expectation of folks having to fill that silence. And oftentimes that falls upon women. So me kind of challenging this idea of small talk and saying that it is completely meaningless could set a lot of people off. And I'm saying it's meaningless to me. I'm saying the concept is meaningless in itself, and I'm also saying it's meaningless to me. But what I'm not saying is that everyone should stop having small talk with one another if that is something that you truly enjoy doing. I think it's more about the expectation that everyone has to do it, even if it's something that makes people uncomfortable for a variety of different reasons, or not even that it's just uncomfortable, it's just something that people just don't like to do. I think there needs to be more variety and like diversity in how people have conversations with one another, and that includes not having conversations with one another, and that being more socially acceptable in a lot of places. So that's why I question small talk as a convention. And I know that I can imagine a lot of people being uncomfortable, particularly those who may have their identity formed over small talk. And I don't necessarily think that this is an intentional thing, although it could be. Maybe some people do intentionally form their identity and make meaning of themselves around small talk. I think a lot of times people are socialized as small talk being part of their identity. And so while I'm talking about these things, they may feel that I am directly attacking their identity, which I am not. Small talk is independent of who you are. Now, you may be a person who has been engaged in small talk your whole life. You become a conversationalist about small talk. It's your jam. You love it, right? I'm not attacking you as a person. I'm just saying the concept of it is technically meaningless, and it's not something that needs to happen like a requirement for everyone. So if you're someone that enjoys small talk, likes to do it, but you come across someone that doesn't, as opposed to, I would say, social convention or society, I think it's the other way around. Like you hear people being like, tips to deal with small talk or make yourself more comfortable with small talk, as opposed to like tips for folks who like small talk to accept that other people don't. You really hear that backwards, that other one. You hear it like, okay, well, this is the standard and the norm, and so we need to fit and conform to these boxes, right? That's the stuff that I'm kind of confused about. Why do we need to do that? And once again, I think it is gendered. And that leads me to the conversation of like, to what we owe one another. What do we owe one another? Do we owe one another the role of making people feel comfortable? Now, I think in a truly egalitarian, equal space, then it makes sense that, we owe it to one another to treat each other kindly and with respect. That's wonderful. I think that's great. And that's kind of separate of what I'm talking about. I know things are related in terms of like, okay, respect, kindness, is that the same as niceness? Not really, because I think niceness the way I define niceness is this performative aspect of it, right? That we have to be kind and chipper, or like chipper and perky and say all these things with no context, especially if it's outside of our natural inclination or our personality, right? A person can be a kind person, but not be bubbly and engage in small talk and I think I know I tend to fall into that category. That most of the time, I have this kind of, or I've been told have this kind of calm demeanor, right? I know I don't speak as much. I'm going to take away from the whole, I'm not going to identify with either being introverted or extroverted for the reasons that I said before. But I don't speak much. And when I speak, I think it's kind of like, I don't want to say it's purposeful. Like sometimes people speak to speak. Well, yeah, obviously there are some people that speak to speak, but I mean, for me, it's like, it's not natural. I'm not naturally inclined to just kind of spontaneously talk about surface level stuff. I guess I'm the type of person that I'm saying, this is funny, but it'd be weird to specifically ask about this, but if you were to be like, would you rather be asked, how was your weekend, versus like, what's the meaning of life? I'd rather be asked the question, what's the meaning of life, than how was your weekend? Or what you do over the weekend, right? I also think that if I had something great or fantastic or something I wanted to tell people, I would tell them. Because I think it's worthy of it. It ends up being a homework assignment almost, when you're like expected to tell people what you did over the weekend and how your weekend was. And oftentimes, we don't want to talk about it. I didn't have a great weekend, or maybe I had a good weekend, but it didn't involve anything that I wanted people to know about or to talk about. For whatever reason, I think the expectation that we have to come prepared to talk about these certain things, because that's just the way that people do it. To what end? For what reason? So that's the kind of thing that I struggle with. And once again, kind of going to the gendered stuff, to what we owe one another. I wonder when it becomes unequal, if oftentimes it is, right, that usually the burden of making folks comfortable tends to fall on women or feminine presenting individuals. People that have the gender expression of a feminine gender expression are typically the ones that have the onus or need the onus of the responsibility to make people feel comfortable. And when it's unequal like that, that's the part that I question too. Why is it up to specific type of people to feel like they have to carry the conversation? Oftentimes when they don't want to. Once again, if you want to do that and you love it and it thrills you and it makes you have that energy, by all means do it. But I think when everyone is expected to fit in that mold, and that includes people who aren't part of that mold, then that's not fair. To what do we owe one another? Do I owe you, do I owe the ritual to you to make you feel uncomfortable by if I see you, that I have to kind of, talk and have these sort of canned responses? Like, I'd rather it be like if the person is personally inclined or invested in a certain thing. They asked me these questions because they were genuinely interested in a specific thing about me versus social convention, then that's great, because that's more meaningful, because I understand the person seeking it out because they are truly interested in it versus feeling like they have to just because of social convention. This could be like a fun drinking game. Take a shot for every time I say social convention. I hope not. Don't do that. Don't drink and drive, folks. So those are my musings. And so I invite folks to think about that. To what do we owe each other? Why is there a certain inequity when it comes to making folks comfortable, which typically, once again, falls into women or feminine presenting individuals? And then also another layer of race in culture and ethnicity, because I'm intersectional AF. Typically it's the marginalized, the oppressed folks too that also have to have that burden of making people uncomfortable. Why? Why do other folks have to hold that power over us? It can be overtly exerted over the oppressed, or it's something that's ingrained and socialized. But either way, I don't think it's necessarily fair. So if you're noticing, you go like, oh yeah, why do I come with the expectations of that? Whether I intend to or notice it or not. And this is another expectation, I think. Social convention makes me have this desire to want to tell you that I don't think you're a terrible person. That in saying these things, that I think once again ties into your identity, that you conflate my discussion about small talk as a convention and a behavior as part of your identity. And so if you're someone that vibes with small talk and I'm saying negative things about it, I think that there's something negative or terrible about you. No. First of all, I don't know you. It doesn't make any sense for me to bash people like that. It's more about the behaviors than it is about the person themselves. So don't take it personally, but also I know that I am feeling that from social convention to make folks feel comfortable, which is also kind of like taking away from the point. That's all to say that I'm at fault with this, to falling for social convention. And this comes from a place of, I would say, a place of pain and sadness. And the fact that this isn't something that I came up with and I was like, oh, you know what, F off, like, small talk is for losers and I'm above that. I don't think I'm above that. I don't think I'm above anyone. The reason I'm challenging these things is because I realized that my challenging it freed me from those expectations. I felt very weighed down and sad and depressed, constantly questioning myself, saying, why am I like this? Like, why can't I let me just do it? Just force myself. It's just so hard, but I just force it. Like, something's wrong with me. Like, why can't I be so more natural like this? Why? And after beating myself so much for it, it took me a while to kind of realize, like, I'm different. I mean, I knew that I'm different, but like being okay with being different. And as soon as I kind of let go, like as soon as I found out that I could just let go of that responsibility, like don't hold myself to that responsibility of engaging in certain social conventions, I felt relief with that. I felt relief in a way that I was like, wow, a huge weight was kind of released, from me. And I'm not to say that I don't still suffer from the insecurities, because I definitely do. Like I'm a human. And I often do kind of waver back and forth, even as I'm saying this, questioning like, do people like me? Will people like me for saying these things and stuff like that? But I think I'd rather have those little moments as opposed to like the overwhelming pressure to conform to something that it isn't for me. And I'm not a terrible person for that. So that's my small talk. About small talk, which actually, as you've realized at this point, is a deeper, more meaningful conversation, which is what I am naturally inclined to. Well, that is that on that. This has been Borderline Latina Takes Over. See you next time.